Hey guys, welcome to Book Review 128. Today I am going to be reviewing Democracy, Indonesia in the 21st Century by Hamish McDonald. Well, this book is not a travel book, and it's not a historical book in sort of the long past history of it, although it very briefly covers old Indonesia, if you will. But what it really is a look at modern times. It covers a little bit of Sukarno and Suharto, but really the majority of the effect that they had on Indonesia is sort of their lasting impact on what current Indonesia looks like, at least as portrayed in this book. So it really covers a lot of the kind of political wheelings and dealings, the corruption, the instability. It covers a lot of like the coup attempts and the way, for example, that like the military plays both its role in society is more broadly defined than you would find like in the United States or in Europe, where they're mostly seen as a defense force. The military, up until very recently, like within the last 5 to 10 years, was more of a police force. It was more influenced. Indonesia was never, or actually it was under Suharto, but post Suharto, it wasn't really like a military junta. It wasn't really a military-run country. But even in the post Suharto years, it was it is very influenced by the military. So like the citizens make the decision through democracy, but if it's not what the military, or if the military doesn't like it, it's not necessarily that they'll overthrow the government, but they'll be kind of in, say, like a ruling or a law that's passed that the military doesn't like. There'll be adjustments in application on the ground, if you will. And that's really kind of like a lot of the way Indonesia works. You also look at sort of the business community. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of sort of Wild West types of dealing. People that are in sort of the inner circles of finance gain and lose fortunes overnight. But for the most part are above the fray of the rest of Indonesia. Indonesia being one of the worst Gini, that's like wealth disparity indexes in the entire world. They're like one of the worst between the high end and the low end. But really in modern times, I know I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Yogyakarta. No, Yogyakarta is the city. It's Yudhoyono. They look similar, but one's a person and one's the president of the country, like Barack Obama, so I should probably know what their name is. So basically what happened is that they had 3 leaders post Sukarto. I believe it was Woody, Megawati, and Burudi, or Budwo, I believe. And the first one, Budwo, was kind of just a placeholder post Sukarto. You know, Indonesia had not had a change in leadership since the late 1960s, and before that, the last leadership was decolonization in the early 1950s, late 1940s. So it was pretty much like sort of an unknown. And kind of interesting that happened, something interesting that happened during Budwo's, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, post-Suharto tenure, is that the head of the military, whose name I'm not going to be able to recall, basically something in Indonesia is like, if there's a military junta, even if all the forces are in place to have an overthrow of the government by the military, the head of the military, the head general, still, as tradition in Indonesian exchange of power, still asks for permission before he actually engages in his junta. And what was interesting about Budwo is that he was not, he was a career politician, but he was largely a technocrat. He wasn't really in the inner circles of politics up until the last few years of Suharto's tenure. Yeah, Suharto's tenure. At which point he, I believe, became vice president. But for the most part, he had like technical jobs, was educated in Germany, I believe. And so when this military general asked for his permission, he said no, not necessarily denying, but he was just kind of unaware of this custom of, well, we're going to do this, but we're going to ask you permission first. And interestingly enough, the military general, the central government still having quite a bit of power. It's not like it would have been obvious that there would have been a military junta, but there would have been probably at least a struggle and maybe an overthrow if that had happened. The next two presidents, the next one was, I said Megawati and, Megawati and Budwo and Wabi, I believe. Well, he was the second one, I believe. Wadi, W-A-D-I or something, or W-H-A-D-I. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was kind of, I believe, came from an Islamist background, but by the time that he had gained presidency, a lot of the sort of more extremist elements of his party were, he wasn't part of that. Like, it was more sort of a mainstream Islamist. We're not going to run the country like a theocracy. We're just going to kind of like the United States maybe in Christianity. We're going to try to apply, or the Christian right maybe. We're going to try to apply some values, but despite whatever the Christian right says in the United States, we're not going to particularly try to create a theocracy in the United States. There's still separation of church and state. And I want to get back to that later because Islam's role in Indonesia is very interesting. The last one was Megawati. The first two kind of had measured progression, if you will. One of the reasons that there was going to be that military junta was because Budwo instilled some policies, I believe, with like when you take power, I've heard decentralization, when you take power from the central government and distribute it out to the provinces and the states and all those kinds of areas. And the military obviously not being happy with that because that would decentralize power for them too, and they become a less powerful organization. Megawati was the daughter of Sukarno, I almost said Sukarno. Sukarno. The first leader that, kind of the difference between Sukarno and Suharto is Sukarno was not a true communist, but he had kind of like vague nationalistic, socialistic, Islamic, kind of like these three tenures coming together in sort of a muddled mass, but an intentionally muddled middle in order to create kind of a compromise between all these various elements, which seems pretty smart, but often led to kind of meandering on policy decisions, not necessarily being real. Indonesia was one of the leaders in the non-alignment movement, which is like countries that were neither part of the Soviet, allied with the Soviet bloc, or allied with the Western bloc, you know, the United States and Western Europe. But, you know, there was a lot of kind of meandering under him. Suharto, and towards the end, he kind of started leaning a little bit more towards communism, like the socialist ideal, which is why a lot of people speculate that the United States was a little bit involved with Sukarno, but for the most part it was internally driven, that the military overthrew Sukarno and put Suharto that ran, if not like a hardline military dictatorship, a pretty, I don't think they ever had elections really under his tenure, and he kind of ruled in the benevolent or a self-proclaimed benevolent leader of that time period. Well, Megawati, let's get back to the somewhat current time. Megawati is the daughter of Sukarno, so she brought a lot of what you would think would be progressive ideals under Sukarno, but really by that time they had become kind of outdated, and she wanted to kind of turn back the clocks of time to her father's time, to sort of the idealism of the founding of the Republic under its first leader. And that didn't play well with progressives, so eventually the leader that Yudho Yono, I believe I'm pronouncing that correct, was the leader for 10 years and is generally considered a very good leader. There was sort of presidential, I think his name's the president, he's the leader of the country. There's presidential fatigue under him in his last few years. Some people were kind of sort of like Obama. Some people were angry that he wasn't progressive enough or did enough to kind of clean up society. Some people were upset with how much he did and kind of wanted to lead back to the old corporate military days. Something else about the military and Indonesian society in general, particularly under Suharto, was that one of the reasons Suharto could be so benevolent is because of the massive amounts of money that he made for his family. Now, he never ran enterprises himself, but all his flock of grandkids pretty much had control of a good, or his friends, had control of a good chunk of the entire economy, or at least of the larger industries of Indonesia. And so it's awfully easy to be benevolent when you're making billions of dollars for yourself and your family. But Yuhono, or Yuhoyono, I guess what kind of happened after him was there was this, let's see if I can get to the very end of it. Jokowi, and he is sort of I've been saying Barack Obama a lot, kind of a Barack Obama figure in that he rose from obscurity to the presidency of the United States in fairly quick order. It was very lucky for Indonesia that he did, because his opponent was somebody that was on the U.S. and like the Hague Court, which is like the international tribunal for war crimes. He was persona non grata for atrocities committed in East Timor in the early 1980s, and then again during East Timor's independence in 1998, I believe. And so obviously it would be a kind of a disaster no matter how good or bad he is as president. Most people thought he would be a pretty bad president, but no matter how good or bad he would be a president, as having someone that is wanted for war crimes as the head of your entire country, that's bad for relations, and obviously. I don't know exactly what they do, but luckily this Jokowi won. When this book was written, it was still very early in his tenure. And so they couldn't really say a whole lot about it. A couple other things the book talks about. I thought the section on the eastern provinces was really interesting, particularly on New Guinea, Western New Guinea, and Eastern New Guinea, or Papua. It's not Papua New Guinea. I think it's Papua Guinea and Western New Guinea, or the provinces, or something like that. But the part of Guinea that is controlled by Indonesia, and really something that's kind of interesting about Indonesia is that you have the primary political power, as messed up as it is at times, but it is a force in Java, and then you have to deal with all the surrounding provinces, a lot that really have to fight because they're total minorities. I think like 60 or 70% of the population of Indonesia is on Java, maybe Java and Bali. But a lot of these provinces, they're sort of ethnically not related. That's something that's interesting about Indonesia, is that it's not at all an ethnic unified country. And it's not mixed in the sense like the United States is, where you have a lot of different people together. You have very strict regional divisions among ethnicities within this one country. And so there's a lot of like ethnic strife between the native New Guineans, not to say the province in AECH, which constantly is in rebellion. You know, you have, I forget what the province is called, but the Indonesian part of Borneo, which has nothing to do largely with Java, it being a much more primitive, if you want to kind of look at it in that crystal or in that context, society. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of tension there, and even to this day, Indonesian Guinea is not completely, but mostly off limits to people that are not from that area, particularly non-Indonesians. And even if you're in Indonesia, I believe that you have to apply for a permit and be accepted by the government in order to immigrate there. So yeah, I guess that's interesting. Kind of the book ends a little bit with talking about Indonesia's relationship with the countries around it, its acrimonious relationship with acrimonious and sometimes beneficial relationship with Australia. It's mostly acrimonial, even though they're basically the same ethnic group. People of Malaysia, particularly the jealousy felt by many Indonesians and how much Malaysia has really economically surpassed Indonesia, particularly like going up the ladder of an advanced society, whereas Indonesia is sort of kind of stuck in the muck of largely being a resource economy and very low-level manufacturing economy. Talked a little bit about Singapore. You know, one of the interesting things about Singapore is everyone thinks Singapore is so great. And it is. It's very clean. It's very well run. In terms of internal economics, it's very free. It's very open. But what people don't say a lot, or what you don't hear a lot, is that a lot of the money that flows into Indonesia flows into Singapore, is money that's flowing from the rest of Southeast Asia into, including largely Indonesia, into Singapore by, if not illegal means that were maybe not necessarily completely above board the entire time. Like the book mentions various like coal contracts and timber contracts where the piece of paper was either forged or non-existent, or if it existed under heavy pressure from the company, under terms that they would want, and where local people really didn't have negotiating power in the environment that they were living in. It mentions also in the book that there's a huge, every year now, because there's been so much land clear from the islands, particularly like with timber and stuff, and with peat too, which is peat is really big in what I'm about to say. There's huge amounts of carbon gas that are released from Indonesia, to the point where even though Indonesia is not an advanced society that largely uses cars like the United States, or a huge manufacturing base like China that's starting to get cars, it's actually, I believe, the third largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the entire world. Part of it being a little bit from coal and burning of coal and cars, modern society, but lots of it being from forests cleared. And it mentions in the book that every year, I believe it's in July maybe, like when the rains are less, there's huge amounts of smoke that basically like cloud Indonesia, to the point where it's not like the smoke, you're standing over fire and immediately inhalating it, but where it's like as if you're in a polluted city, even if you're not in a polluted city, just because of the amount of greenhouse gases that are released from the environment. Okay, well, I'm running a little long. The one thing I will say is that I wish there would have been a little bit more personal accounts. Largely, this book was political in nature. A lot of times it covered some of the figures that would be interesting if you knew kind of their context, but was kind of like this general, this political leader, this general, this political leader, you know. And it's interesting, but it's kind of hard unless you have some context going into it for what they're exactly talking about. It's a little didactic in that way. Well, anyway, Democracy, Indonesia in the 21st Century. It's a good book. Check it out, you guys. All right, run along. Bye.